Hello everybody and welcome to the 5th lecture of Internet Forum. I'm Aina, the course assistant here. And today our first speaker is Hanna Nikkanen, the co-founder and environmental editor at Longplay. Go ahead.
Thank you, Aino, and welcome everyone. So I will be talking today about the two great threats, as cyber risks and climate change, and the spaces where they intersect and meet. And my name is Hanna Nikkanen. I'm a journalist. I do sustainability research as a kind of a side gig. I'm interested in the vulnerabilities in our societies that become evident now that we're moving into an era of more instability and intersecting crises. My work currently revolves around ecological crises. I have a very long-running interest in digital freedoms and surveillance and societal impacts of the internet. And I've written a couple of books about that topic. So long story short, I have two favorite topics. One is climate change. Another thing I write about is digital risks and threats. And today marks the first time that I've ever been asked to talk about those two together. So I'm very, very grateful for that opportunity. And taken individually, those two topics both are incredibly big right now. This is from the AXA Future Risk Report. They asked 3,500 experts in different parts of the world to name the top risks that they see being relevant in a 5 to 10 year time scale. And I want to talk about the way that these two teams that are on top for 2021 here are connected, and how possibly many of the solutions, or at least our ways to adapt to living on a permanently high risk level regarding these both topics, how those ways might go hand in hand or contribute to each other. And one thing that since this is a very emerging topic, there's not that much research about the intersection of the climate crisis and cyber risks. There is more and more of that happening now, but it is still a new fledgling topic. And that means that during this lecture, I will also be drawing from examples that, like, for example, the COVID pandemic, which is a good example of an emergency, of a state of exceptional living that is very relevant to what we can then expect life to be under other kinds of emergencies, other kinds of exceptional times. But I will be using these kinds of parallels. So bear with me when I do that. Anyways, one kind of being able to think about multiple crises at the same time and see their differences and similarities is super important now also because we. I think this concept of polycrisis, which is introduced by a financial historian called Adam Tooze, it's relevant and useful. So he describes the polycrisis as a situation which is not just a list of multiple crises, which you can probably easily imagine what could be a list of multiple crises this year when you have war in Europe, but you also have extreme heat waves and droughts and fires in Europe, and you have geopolitical tensions that can come out in surprising ways, and you have threats to democracy in different countries. So you might have a threat of nuclear escalation or terrorist movements. And inflation and recession. So polycrisis is not just listing these different states of emergency or worries that we are facing, but it's also that these things are linked, and when they happen simultaneously, they often escalate each other. Just to show it quickly, this is a super ugly slide, but just to illustrate, this is Adam Tooze's chart where he illustrates kind of the different crises happening, or some of the different crises happening right now. impacting each other in Europe right now. So we have, the climate crisis is escalating the hunger crisis, and it's escalating recession, and what else? The recession is escalating the hunger crisis, and inflation is escalating recession. And you could add so many more rows to that chart. There are so many things missing from that, make it a lot more complicated. And a chart like this can be a fun tool to play with if you like really dystopian things like I do. And today we're going to kind of imagine one nexus of threats like this. So looking at cyber threats and climate change, which could, on someone's chart, often on my chart, they're present on an Excel sheet like that. And then looking at the ways in which they might impact each other. And the way that they impact each other basically is that climate change impacts cyber risks. That's the significant direction. Cyber risks do not that much impact climate change. It could be argued, someone will maybe want to argue that it does, but mostly the direction that I find relevant is that climate change impacts cyber risks. And I'm going to structure this lecture around these three categories of climate change impacts, which are direct, cascading, and transition impacts. And this is a fairly simple and general categories. Direct means that's easy. It's storms, floods, so on. What do they do to our societies and infrastructures and so on? And how? What do they do? How do they impact, for example, the risk that cyber crime poses on us? Then there's cascading, which then means the sort of the second level of climate impacts. Climate change is not just storms and floods and heat waves and rising sea levels. It also means political instability, immigration, food price volatility, energy price volatility, and so on. So that has political, economic, cross-border impacts that also create new vulnerabilities. And then the last part is I'm going to talk about transition impacts. That means generally that it's the climate or the impacts of climate policies. I'm going to use that more as a opportunity to also talk about some opportunities that kind of living in a time that not only has risks but also has a lot of potential for doing things differently, for looking for places where systems need to change and they can be changed. Anyways, so I'm moving on, starting. There's a color coding. I don't know if anyone cares about that, but I have different colors when I kind of move on through these different impact categories. And we'll start with the direct impacts. What does happen to cyber risks when we have physical, direct, very concrete impacts of the climate emergency? One very, very important one is this. Clearly, climate change and cyber attacks tend to target and attack the same critical infrastructure. And by critical infrastructure, I mean like water, food, energy production, electricity grids, the telecommunications. And these are infrastructures that are heavily digitized. They are always at risk of cyber attacks. And sometimes their vulnerabilities to extreme weather events is obvious, like storms can knock out water supplies or electricity grids or sewage systems and so on. And droughts and floods can clears and sea level rise is a risk to all kinds of infrastructure in coastal areas. And sometimes these impacts, these direct impacts on infrastructure are less obvious, which I kind of realized one case of that this summer. Because because only this summer I realized that drought is a risk to nuclear energy production, which I had never ever thought about. Even though then, like when you think about that, it's quite obvious cooling water is needed, and when in reactors, and I should have been aware of that, but I'm aware that reactors need cooling water. But this summer was the first time that it sort of happened at least to my knowledge, that nuclear reactors were facing trouble in Central Europe because cooling water ran out, because major rivers ran out of water. And I just had never lived through that kind of a drought that Central Europe had this year. So that risk had never occurred to me. And that's also one aspect of this time of the polycrisis, that not only had I never experienced that kind of drought in Central Europe, that I would have ever thought about nuclear reactors in that kind of a severe drought, I had also never lived through a moment when that sort of drought coincides with such a major energy crisis that Europe is in. So this, like these vulnerabilities and kind of combined risks are kind of exposing them, like they're emerging, they're surprising us, and that will likely happen. We know that will happen more and more in the future. Just end up having this kind of a crisis and this totally different kind of a crisis, and then what happens when you mix them, and then you find out. So for me, the fact that nuclear energy production hit a crisis this summer in France was that kind of a surprise. But anyways, when we talk about cyber threats, what's dangerous about climate change related, or generally extreme weather events, when it comes to the risk of cyber threats, is that weather events are always extremely public. You cannot hide the fact that you were just hit by a storm, or massive flooding near your, let's say, energy infrastructure. Any potential attacker will know exactly when your critical infrastructure is under a lot of extra pressure. Other kinds of pressure can maybe be hidden from potential attack. Storms are public. So if you're having a climate-driven crisis, plus you're having an enemy and a potential attacker who understands the impact of the crisis, they will have public intel about when is a good time to stage their attack. And maybe that's also kind of why I've been super fascinated by these simultaneous things. Obviously, it's also not a coincidence, for example, that Russia's attack on Ukraine, which had a big impact on the food markets in the world, but it also took place in a moment when, for example, North Africa and the Horn of Africa have been going through like 5 years of drought, meaning that the devastation caused by the war in Ukraine and the impact of that on, for example, grain trade in the world, it's not fully a coincidence that that Russia's attack has a particularly devastating impact this year. Not saying that Russia wouldn't have attacked if it wasn't for drought in North Africa, but these are strategies that are becoming more relevant right now as climate-driven crises hit us more and more often. And maybe like after this year or during this year, worries about geopolitical risks, state-driven sabotage, major state-driven attacks on infrastructure don't sound as distant now as they maybe did to many people still a year or two ago. we've had fairly recently, not only the Nord Stream pipelines, but also sabotage, suspected political state-sponsored sabotage of data cables in near the Svalbard Islands, fears around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in Ukraine. So the current world situation is forcing us to look at infrastructure in a new way and seeing vulnerabilities in places where we used to see stable and helpful infrastructure. And anyways, and there's the Swiss cheese metaphor, which maybe is fairly familiar to many of you, so that when you have a lot of layers of defenses, or generally, every defense has some holes, and it becomes dangerous when those holes, when those weaknesses align, so that threats can come through. And if you imagine having sort of a vulnerability that, for example, an extreme weather event can cause to infrastructure, then if you think about those other layers or those other holes in defenses being, for example, having a pandemic that impacts workforce and supply chains, or having an erosion of public trust, meaning that people are unwilling to follow official recommendations and so on. So that's why that's also a kind of an aspect of the idea of the polycrisis, is that that's just a lot of holes in a lot of weaknesses that have the capacity to line up. And they can be, especially when we're talking about, for example, critical infrastructure, those may be easy to exploit. And then there are another kind of direct impacts of climate change, which is, here I'm using COVID-19 as a case. So emergencies do create vulnerabilities for criminals to exploit. It's just the state of living in unfamiliar circumstances, having to improvise, having to run a society on unfamiliar settings, creates vulnerabilities both to individuals and organizations. And I'm using COVID basically because what happened during COVID was that immediately in the beginning, or almost immediately in the beginning of lockdowns, for example, individuals were targeted by online skimming. It increased very, very much immediately, because obviously people are spending more time on their computers. They're having to run their lives a lot more online. People who are maybe not that familiar, who maybe don't have the experience of running their lives online, were doing it. People who would otherwise maybe not use their credit card online were forced to do it. And that was immediately exploited by attackers. Also, organizations, companies had to move a lot of their sensitive operations to home networks because there was no other option. Cyber defenses were just generally lowered because organizations and people had their focus elsewhere. And hospitals were targeted by ransomware attacks. Because basically having an organization that is completely overwhelmed with an emergency may be more likely to pay ransom instead of putting their resources on finding other solutions to having their systems being locked in the middle of a horrible situation. So exceptional situations always create vulnerabilities. And this is something that could happen and is likely to happen during prolonged floods, storms, etc. And then moving on, so cascading impacts. Cascading impacts are, as I said, they're the impacts that are kind of on a second level. It's not just that you were hit by a storm, but maybe some other country somewhere was hit by a storm, and now you suddenly lost the trading partner that you used to buy food from, or some other country was hit by a drought and suddenly you're dealing with a refugee situation, or there's a conflict that is fueled not always only by climate change, but multiple things. You have a conflict that is fueled by the fact that food is expensive. People don't have jobs. People who used to work in agriculture cannot do that. And there's maybe a dictator. And then the combination of those things, the frustration, the fear, etc., starts coming out in violence. And that is, and then one thing that is less dramatic than running out of food completely, or having a refugee crisis, or civil war starting. One thing that is more subtle, but is real, is kind of like the question of who are likely to become perpetrators in cybercrime. And obviously, this is not an exhaustive answer. People become criminals in lots of situations. But one thing that we know about cybercrime and kind of the production of people who fit the profile that is likely or has a higher likelihood to choose cybercrime as a career, what you need for that is that the likelihood gets higher when you have a situation where there's, for example, no good jobs for the young. When there is a good enough educational level, there's good enough tools, there's enough access to technology, enough language skills that it is possible to have a lucrative, or at least some kind of a career in cybercrime. So it can be in online fraud, it can be working in some organizations, online army, whatever. It can be running a troll factory or working in a troll factory. I'm using the cybercrime, a very broad definition here, but even if we think about like online fraud. So it's people without livelihoods, people without a clear view of their future, people with low trust in their systems, in their society's capacity to carry them towards a decent future, and definitely and enough education. And the thing here is that climate change is pushing a lot of sort of formerly middle income countries that were not among, for example, the richest in Europe, but had decent educational level, lots of university graduates, much more like very high level of high school graduates, access to technology, language skills, but the countries that are also kind of moving towards sort of this prolonged recessions, increasing gaps between the rich, the ones that have opportunities, and then the ones that do not have. And that's happening, again, you can see that happening. For example, I think good reasons for why online scams, so many online scams, email scams originate in Nigeria are clearly that it has an English-speaking population. It has a decent, it has an okay educational system. It has a lot of urban people who are not rich, who maybe don't have a lot of opportunities, but they are still able to get an education enough to basically be able to run different frauds and scams online and so on. So anyways, or why are there so many malware attacks coming from the Balkans and previously from Ukraine? Not anymore. The malware attacks from Ukraine have pretty much ended during this year because people do have other concerns right now. But there are like Southeastern European countries that produce a lot of cybercrime. Again, high education and low expectations for the future. Anyway, so that is a combination that is happening, that is being driven by climate change. So poorer developing countries are being pushed towards like abject poverty, and then poorer industrialized countries are being pushed towards this sort of a almost failed state status, maybe never actually fail, but it means that a lot of people are falling through the cracks. And then there's this one case that I worked a lot on, which is just generally, I think, a good illustration of the polycrisis, cascading impacts of many things, among them climate change, which is the Arab Spring, just to show how things are connected in today's conflicts. When the Arab Spring happened in 2011, and I spent a lot of time during the next years reporting on it, there was often this kind of a debate about whether we can pin this to a cause. And they were the people saying that, well, it's the drought in Syria. It's the drought in Syria that caused it. And then someone will attack that person and say that, well, it can't be just the drought in Syria. That's a stupid idea and you can't prove that. And then someone else will say that, no, it's the social media. It's social media that triggered this crisis because young people were suddenly getting news about what's happening in their countries and corruption and so on. And then obviously someone will then jump in and say that that's a totally stupid theory because it can't be just social media. And I think we're now moving more towards a time when we don't have to have those frustrating debates anymore. It can clearly be climate change and technology and market crisis. And digitalization generally. Anyway, so what happened then was that, for example, mass unemployment impacted especially kind of the little brothers in Arab countries or like Middle East, Northern African countries. Little brothers meaning that families often could find work for two of the older, like the oldest son, maybe two older sons, and then the third and fourth kids just basically were kind of left without anything meaningful to do in the traditional economy. That's both because of unemployment, because of the economy, but also because just demographic pressure. There were so many young people. Because they're like the population pyramid in those countries. For example, Egypt at that point looked like this. They had a lot of people between 0 and 25 years old. And then the top of the pyramid was very narrow. And then all of the power was concentrated on the top of the pyramid in the oldest age groups. Anyways, not to dwell too long on that, because this is more like just this a small detour, just that what was the outcome of this crisis? What can we say now when it's 10 years after? What happened was that we had war, we had refugee crisis, and then one thing that happened was that autocratic governments started investing massively in mass surveillance, and this was kind of a seismic shift on the interface between human security and the internet, where you had movements that started with people actually having the hope that digital technology can help them right the wrongs in their societies, that can help them take the power from the top of the pyramid to the younger generation. They can operate this technology that their grandparents cannot, that their presidents cannot operate. And then there was a massive flashback, and in the end, the world is not the same now as it was back then. There's much less room for maneuver for example, young activist movements in the Middle East after that. So, anyways, I guess what I wanted to say was that this seems to be, to me, the first like real moment of polycrisis of the century, and maybe that's why there was so much debate about, like, so much kind of anger around the definitions of like whether this is a climate-driven conflict or not, or whether this is economy-driven conflict or not, whether this is something completely different, whether this is a social media revolution, and where like now is clearly more the time to get used to the fact that from now on conflicts will be multiple kinds of conflicts at the same time. Anyways, moving on to transitional impacts, and this is something like where I will start wrapping up here. Also, like I will try to be brief here because this is something that I hope that Jaana will talk about after me. So this is about governance. This is about how transitions from older systems to newer systems, from flawed systems that are not very shock-proof, transitions from those systems to then something else, some other type of governance that can take these systemic risks into account and sort of allow us to live relatively securely in a world that is permanently riddled with danger. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. And then I think Jaana Tapanainen-Thiess will then continue from that because she's much more of an expert. But this to me means that, for example, there are some principles in environmental law that are very relevant to also kind of to cyber security governance. For example, how much risk is acceptable in our society? How big risks can be taken, should be taken in an unstable, unpredictable situation? Who is responsible if there are damages that occurred? How can governance be used to make sure that excessive risk-taking is not incentivized and innocent people don't have to bear the entire burden of damages when something goes wrong? For example, if we're thinking about some of the major massive leaks, data leaks, for example, the Vastaamo case, and sort of the legislation around that kind of like sort of the legislation around cyber risk-taking and the risks that creates for individual people. That thinking is very close to a lot of discussion in environmental law, for example, about the impacts of pollution on people or long-term impacts of climate change on people. And then how is international cooperation managed when risks are cross-border by nature and again difficult to predict. So there are some cool questions here that I like to think about. For example, centralized versus distributed systems. This is sort of very much a sort of a network kind of an idea. It's something that is coming up a lot in, for example, food production now. Are we safer with having food production in a time of climate crisis and possible attacks on production if it's distributed, or should it be centralized, which is when it's the most efficient? What kinds of rules do we need for a stable world? And if we're not in a stable world now, and we probably never will be in a very stable world anymore, so what kinds of different rules do we need? What kinds of different considerations and priorities do we need? So these are just things. These are ideas that I think are very that are shared in cyber governance and risk management and environmental risk management. And then one thing that's also super interesting is sort of like, how do we want to respond to crisis? when there's an overwhelming sense of crisis going on, which again this year during the war in Ukraine, there has, for example, in European decision making has been very much centered around questions of how do we deal with this one big massive crisis that is going on, and is this now a reason to kind of take a break from all of the other considerations because we do have a war, and this is like more just as an anecdote, but I thought it was super interesting that in the summer, the German CDU and CSO made a list of things, a regulation that they want to strip, EU regulation that is unnecessary or harmful now when we are in a war. When there is a war in Europe and companies are already bearing a lot of burden of that, and the legislation that they wanted to cancel in the EU was like two things. It was environmental and it was digital. So those were kind of the two. They wanted to cancel rules about cybersecurity because it's expensive to have rules about cybersecurity for companies. It adds to their administrative burden that they would be obliged to take measures on cybersecurity. And then there were also like, climate targets, pesticide regulation and so on. And I thought that was super interesting, that those were like, if those are the two, if environmental crisis and cyber risks are at the same time big drivers for the crisis, and very big potential certain drivers for future crises, but they are also the questions that when a crisis hits, when a conflict hits Europe, then it becomes very easy to suggest that maybe we don't regulate these things now. This is just a kind of my rant about that, but it's kind of like, whether decision making in a time of consecutive crisis is short-sighted or future-oriented. Something that I hope that Jaana Tapanainen-Thiess will then help us understand how that can, like how future-oriented responses can be can be incentivized, can be supported in a time when everyone or most people are grappling with some kinds of crisis or just recovering from a crisis. At least to me, also feels that just kind of barely recovering from the shock of the pandemic and lockdowns and being isolated from others. And now there's already these other crises, and I'm kind of worried that the rest of my life will look like that. Sorry about that. So this is kind of like as for take-home messages that we're living in a time of a polycrisis. It's not, the threats are not linear because they impact each other, they surprise us, but they definitely create vulnerabilities that are being and will be even more exploited by cyber attackers, both on individual level, or towards individual people and towards organizations. And now I was thinking about looking at some of the questions. Maybe I'll ask you in the audience, does anyone have a question here in the room, or do I move on to the ones from people online?
I think we can first go through the questions online.
Yep,
maybe.
Sure.
I can read them aloud for you. So the first question was, what do you think the developed world can do to prevent the incoming cascade of crises caused by climate change? Is more aid for the developing world the only way out?
That's a very good question. It's also a very, very big question. There's like, of course, you can talk about that. What can be done to help the developed world survive crisis? In, like, for one, there's mitigation. How can we stop those crises from happening? Which would then mean that the developing world would have to have strong, proactive climate policies, which right now it's looking a bit bad because climate policies are definitely not on the agenda in the global north right now. But definitely, like, of course, the best way to deal with a crisis is if you can prevent the crisis. You cannot prevent all crises now. But maybe the other thing, I do not want to think that aid would be the only way out. Definitely, like when we're talking about direct aid, this often can't solve hunger crisis without aid. So aid is not a bad thing. Aid is a great thing. But then, of course, in a lot of ways, this connects to what I said about distributed responses versus centralized responses. That what we're learning this year, for example, is that it's not a great idea that Ukraine produces all of the grain, all of wheat, which is a massive amount of food for the entire Horn of Africa. That it's not like having centralized systems that maybe worked to some level in a very stable world where trade connections were kind of seen as bringers of peace, and it made sense to do the most efficient thing, which is that let's move all of the production to Ukraine. It had such that they have amazing soil, anything grows, you can produce so much food. So let's just get rid of food production in East and Northern and Eastern Africa, and let's just let them buy food from Ukraine. So this year we're seeing that was not a great idea for a system that is heading into an endless series of crises. So that I think is much more important to kind of identify the ways in which there are vulnerabilities that will stop poorer countries from responding and from basically being self-sufficient, or at least close to self-sufficient in their most basic needs, and how to help them rebuild their own food production. And that was kind of like maybe a part of what I was thinking about in that, like one of my last slides, is that that centralized and like efficient production is great for some time in some situations when everything is stable. Trade links can be great, but we're learning now that they can make it extremely vulnerable. So if we're all buying all our energy, or a lot of our energy from Russia, it's a vulnerability. If Somalia is buying all of their grains from Ukraine, it's a huge vulnerability, and that even worse, it's a kill system if we have hunger. Hunger can't really be negotiated with. So that's definitely more important, I think, than thinking of this as a kind of heading into only aid. But of course, it's not easy. The agenda in the global north right now, but definitely, like of course, the best way to deal with the crisis, and then that's a big question of what happens to people living in those areas now.
Thank you for the answer. The next question was, if cyber threats are increasingly coming from poorer parts of the world, how can this be solved without trying to enact more control on those places? What regulatory body could achieve that? Isn't that too interventionist or necessary?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I don't like. Yeah, absolutely. I don't think. I cannot think of regulation that could really answer the. No, this is a very like a Nordic welfare state kind of a answer, but having more police, for example, has never really stopped people from committing crime because they're poor. Having less people who are poor has stopped people from committing crimes that are motivated by like economic needs. Obviously, like definitely cyber threats, like law enforcement, regulation against cyber threats will be more and more important, but it will not be able to address kind of the lowest levels of the ladder where people are coming in to work, for example, work for organized crime, like organized digital crime, that supply, if that supply is never ending, the supply of frustrated, jobless young people, then that cannot be regulated. So that is again more of a question of economic equality, whether whether, for example, European countries can stop the gap between the rich and the poor from getting bigger, because if that gets bigger, if that continues to get bigger, it does mean that the supply of people who see a future in a career of cybercrime keeps getting bigger, and that cannot be plugged there. So definitely, I would not see much hopes for, like, not only that it will be interventionist and not okay for I don't know, international regulation to start going after poor people in poor countries, but also don't see it as being very efficient either.
Thank you. There were no other questions online. Is there somebody in the audience here who would like to ask a question? All right. So then I'd like to thank you, Hanna, for the great presentation. And welcome to the stage our next speaker, Jaana Tapanainen-Thiess, who is Secretary General of the Government Report on the Future and the Government Foresight Group.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here today. My name is Jaana Tapanainen-Thiess. I'm from the Prime Minister's office. Perhaps a little bit of background. I've lived 25 years abroad. I'm a rather recent returnee back to Finland. And I've been working mostly in Germany. I lived there for 18 years, and before I returned to Finland, I was working at the Prime Minister's Office of United Arab Emirates, working there as an advisor for futures. Today's topic is about future-oriented structures of decision-making, and I'll be telling a little bit about how we in the Finnish government try to look into the future. How do we embrace uncertainty? How do we deal with uncertainty? What kind of future-oriented structures? And I'm more perhaps talking about the idea how to think than about the actual sort of content or going into going too much to detail into specific topics, because the topics are numerous. We have a very long track record in future-oriented structures of decision-making. The Parliament of Finland established the Committee for the Future already back in 1993. And since then, each electoral period, we have submitted a government report on the future for the committee. And this forms this very formal sort of futures dialogue between the government and the parliament. Since 2003 already, all the ministries developed so-called future reviews, and these are also done each electoral period. The aim of these is to provide information for forthcoming elections and government formation negotiations. And as you may know, we are entering into elections, and so this is something we have just published a couple of weeks ago. We have also a so-called Government Foresight Group. It was founded in 2015. It's an advisory group with the objective to advance national foresight activities and also link foresight to decision-making processes. But being in Finland, I think it's very important to also talk about future studies, because it's a very established field in Finland. And the Finnish Society of Future Studies was established already back in 1980, and that was done on the recommendation of the Government Central Board of Research Councils. And there were 14 Finnish institutions of higher education that were the founding members. We have a Finland Futures Research Center, which is one of the few university departments which is devoted to futures research in the whole world. So if Finland Futures Research Center is not known yet, I recommend to have a look at their websites. And that was also founded in 1992. We have a Finland Futures Academy. It was founded in 1998. It's a national network of universities, and they provide academic education and research programs in future studies. These Futures Academy study modules are offered in member universities throughout Finland. Why are these important when we talk about the government context? For example, many who have studied, like our Prime Minister, she has had courses in future studies in her studies. Through being in perhaps the Committee for the Future, many of our Prime Ministers have already had experience in futures thinking through being a member of that. So before even we go into government context, there people who make decisions might have a very good foundation in futures thinking, which is very important. Education and still also futures literacy is now in our core curriculum in schools, and it's taught under multiliteracy, and it's covering also media literacy. We have a so-called National Skills Anticipation Forum, which produces information on the competency, skills and educational needs of working life in the future. So there is a lot going on, and it has been going on for quite some time. So at this very moment, the Committee for the Future is organizing first ever summit for other committees for the future. Finland is the first in the world to have a Committee for the Future in the Parliament. But other countries have been following suit as well, so they are organizing a first international sort of forum today and tomorrow to how can we advance these kind of structures in other parliaments as well. We have a very broad consensus on the need for foresight. There is a widely shared view for foresight and considerable acceptance within various levels of the government. Our strengths are openness and trust. The way we work is very closely about, or very centered on co-creation, collaboration, and participation. There is a broad engagement of stakeholders and widely involving citizens, civil society, businesses, and other actors. And we aim to generate dialogue. So, for example, now in a few weeks' time, we will be submitting the government report on the future of this government period, and the main aim is to create discussion and dialogue. But also the way they have been conducted is founded in dialogue. And we are having continuous efforts and investment to strengthen the use of strategic foresight in decision making. And future is a moving target. So this is something we are dealing with on a daily basis and try to improve our ways. And with this kind of work, with the continuous and cross-governmental foresight, what we can is create a framework for monitoring the environment, to connect then singular events in the environment to a broader context. We can develop and direct measures and actions in ever-changing environment, and also improve our responsiveness and readiness for change to future changes in the environment. I don't know how much foresight you've had, if you have some foresight studies or future studies, but one of the biggest advantages of foresight is really to solve complex problems. So it's important to increase also our decision makers' understanding of scenario-based scenario processes, and they form also the key cognitive steps in solving complex problems. So just the main sort of points is to create an understanding of the big picture, societal, technological, economical, ecological, political factors, to identify the interdependencies, to create an understanding of the drivers of change, to create and form hypotheses of alternative developments, implications, to identify and evaluate policy options, to have a systemic assessment of risk, and then to have that monitoring, continuous monitoring of the environment, and then of the implementation measures. About anticipatory governance, within the government period, what we're trying to do is to support in situational awareness and analysis. We do thematic foresight work and futures work. And then within government period, we have these ministerial future reviews. What we are also preparing at the moment is the messages of secretaries, which are the highest ranking public servants in the ministries. So you could say the CEOs of the ministries, their messages for the next government. With the continuous foresight, that's something that is ongoing, and we are trying to develop our ways to have an ongoing foresight processes, and then also to have more common tools and move into a continuous horizon scanning processes. And like I said, the third pillar, that's the futures dialogue with the Parliament. The counterpart of the Prime Minister's office is the Committee for the Future, but we are also trying to look of ways how to engage other committees in the Parliament. So what are the questions we're sort of asking ourselves is there sort of mainly threefold about the how to create that shared understanding, what are the factors affecting the future of Finland, the drivers of change, and are we strategically prepared for possible disruptions? Regarding strategic dialogue, what kind of assumptions of future developments is our strategies or programs based on? What are our strategic options? What kind of wind tunneling stress testing is being made? And then these imperative actions, contingency plans, and then the responsive to complex changing conditions. And then generally, how do we think about the future? Or actually, I would need to say futures because it's plural. So the starting point in our work is to think in alternatives. So we are not trying to guess the future right, but try to figure out alternative developments for developments. How do we deal with complexity and how to increase systems understanding? The Prime Minister's office is coordinating and developing joint foresight work of the government and of the ministries, and our focus is to bring the future challenges and opportunities to be discussed and explored and decided together. We also want to increase this link between strategic foresight and decision making. In corporate context, I think this link is more clear. It's seldom that a company is doing foresight work without it affecting the decision making. And in this in government, I think this is strategic planning is something that we need to still also enforce. Then go into some of these main foresight processes. Some of these I mentioned. The government report on the future that forms the foundation for the joint and continuous foresight, and the continuous foresight in the ministries is something we are trying to improve at the moment, and the horizon scanning as well. the main Foresight networks, we have a ministerial Foresight panel, which is exactly for cross-governmental foresight work. This government foresight group, advisory group. We have a national foresight network. So if you want to visit some of the events that we're organizing, for example, FinSight is a yearly foresight event that's on the 3rd of November. This year's topic is Future's Power. Who is using the power? And how can we make sure that the power is more broadly distributed? So foresight.fi if you want to have a look or want to add your email and to be more informed about the work that we do. We also organize so-called Foresight Fridays. If there are some certain topics or processes, methods that we like to talk about. Since a few years, the EU has also started to strengthen the foresight activities. There is a so-called EU Foresight Network, and upcoming is ESPAS conference. It's the yearly conference, then again, of the European Commission and European Parliament regarding using foresight to support decision-making. Also, the international foresight community, for example, OECD Government Foresight Network, and UNESCO is doing a great job, for example, to improve futures literacy. United Nations is also in our common agenda, has set very important steps to embrace foresight and how we take care of future generations. A few words of the government report on the future. So even though it was done and has been done since 30 years, this government period, we changed the way we conducted that report very fundamentally. And here we come to sort of the cycle when the government submits the government report on the future to the parliament. The parliament prepares a report back to the government. That report from parliament has resolutions, and then the government responds back to those resolutions every year in our annual report. So it's an ongoing cycle. It's not just sort of one way. It's not two ways. It's ongoing dialogue and an ongoing improvement of how do we tackle these issues better, and whether it's about processes or whether it's about content. And I do recommend you to have a look at the Committee for the Future website. They publish a lot of information, a lot of studies, and it's a great source of information if you're interested in futures, and I would assume everybody of us are. So they made a resolution last government period, and they expected the government to prepare scenarios, and these scenarios need to take into account the uncertainty of the global operating environment, and that to be more prepared. Also, the government report has been outsourced previously to researchers, to consultancies, and this government period, it's the first time that we have done the thinking ourselves. So the first part of the government report on the future is a scenario process of Finland in 2040, and it's done by all ministries. And with this new way, we have pushed for anticipatory governance, this whole of government approach, dialogue, deliberation, and inclusion. So this is also in order to the complexity of the operating environment also requires us to take a more comprehensive approach. So we've moved from one topic to an big picture thinking. So we've looked at 360 degrees. We have gone from continuity thinking to more dealing with uncertainty and complexity. Like I said, from outsourcing foresight to doing it ourselves. So it has been a massive learning experience. It has increased the foresight capacity, but also required a very great investment of resources. And here we come to some of the challenges. So it has been done by all ministries, expert researchers, the National Foresight Network, and citizens. So we've looked at, like I said, 360 degrees, and sort of coming from the global environment to decision-making processes. Usually our focus is some 10 plus years. Regarding COVID or in this pandemic, I've done scenarios which are actually less than 1 year. So uncertainty has really come much closer. When I was in United Arab Emirates, I was helping to create a vision of UAE in 2071, sorry. So 50 years into the future. So the timeframes can really vary from less than a year into really visionary work, looking plus 50 years into the future. The government report on the future scenarios, which is about the future generations, is about 20 years timeframe. The basic processes are about continuity. What do we know? What are the drivers of change, and dealing with uncertainty, and try to look for alternative developments. And then, of course, making that analysis about implications, contingency plans, and the identification of sort of must-win battles for Finland in the coming years. So those would be the issues that we need to tackle, irrespective of the future that we are heading to. So here is the process that we have done. We've done a substantial environmental analysis. We've identified key uncertainties, developed hypotheses of these into the future. We've written the scenario logic, scenario narratives, roadmaps. Each ministry has done scenario implications, made contingency plans, and then also identified these must-win battles. And the last piece of work that is continuing now, after the report is ready, is to go into this continuous horizon scanning. And one of the things I'd like to remind is that scenarios are not about guessing the future right. It's not about predicting. It's not about what's likely to happen. It's about possible future developments. And they're not founded in certainty. They are founded in uncertainty. And this makes it, of course, very difficult when scenarios can be taken out of context. Some of wordings can be taken out of context. So I do hope that we are past that point, so that society is also more ready to deal with scenario work and scenario thinking. It's a very systematic way to identify changes and discontinuities in the operating environment. And it's a very creative and structured discussion about the future. So this is sort of the only content slide about, or actually I have 2 slides about some of the content. Here are some identified drivers for change, societal. We've discussed, for example, demographics, migration, inequality and equality, spatial segregation of regions and urban development, fragility of well-being and mental health. We've looked at people's values and attitudes, competencies, resilience, sort of the 4th industrial revolution, transformation of the information environment, cybersecurity, foreign transformation of the space, energy and critical infrastructure. In economic drivers, the global economic development, trends challenging the financing of the welfare society, transformation of work, new forms of economy, and then the worldwide increase in consumption. We looked at climate change, biodiversity loss, competition for dwindling natural resources, state of the environment, and then food production, water and soil. And then very topical, of course, for the time being, the changes in the multilateral and rule-based system, great power rivalry, EU coherence and agency, democracy, methods of influence, international rule of law development, and rise of authoritarianism, radical societal mobilization, fragmented and intertwined safety and security, the development of Russia, but also Africa. So this is another content slide about the work. These are a few of the questions that has been raised about creating sort of the future preparedness. What are the issues that have perhaps what are the main questions? So how can we keep the welfare society's value proposition in the future? How we can create an operating environment that generates sustainable growth? How we can safeguard the funding base of the welfare society, the sustainability gap? How we can mitigate climate change, combat biodiversity loss, transition to a low carbon economy that is fair? How we can influence our operating environment so we can successfully promote peace, stability, sustainable development, democracy and human rights, and how we can secure the ability of future generations to lead socially, economically, environmentally sustainable lives. We've had 50 citizen dialogues. We tried to think of ways how we can engage with citizens better. So we partnered with Time Out Foundation, and these dialogues serve as input into the report. We've invited people from very different backgrounds, and especially young people. And these dialogues are also part of government's pledges, for example, of the new kind of interaction. And one of the things of what we were asking is people to talk about their hopes. What are they hopeful about regarding the future? What are their fears regarding the future? And how they envision the future in 2040. And then we combined the scenario work with actual quotations from those dialogues. And that is sort of, according to the thinking of Gibson, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. So we took content out of those dialogues and then placed them in our 4 scenarios that we have described. So it's just a question which of those things that are already present now will be enforced going forward. So in this work that we've done, 12 ministries have been the core working group, and it's really about this collaboration. And I do hope that also in the future we will have a very collaborative participatory process to try to create an insight and understanding how the future of Finland will look like. This complete work we started in spring of 2020, exactly when COVID hit, and that led us to do all this work, whether it was the citizen dialogues, the whole scenario process with the 12 ministries. Everything was done remotely. So I think this is also a testimony to Finnish capability of taking everything online. So everything was done remotely. Because it might be a little bit difficult to follow these kind of like, what are the ways of engaging different entities. I've tried to put some structures into what kind of engagement, what kind of entities have been participating in this process. So I'm very sorry about this very full slide, but I think that helps perhaps to understand this dialogue, this futures dialogue within government, but also then when we go and submit the report to the parliament. So I didn't include now all the external parties, the researchers who've helped us create this report, but to really just within government and parliament. So the Ministerial Foresight panel, there is members from each of the ministry. This has been our core working group. It has been dealt with in all ministries in different departments. It has been dealt with in the Government Foresight Group, which is chaired by the State Secretary of the Prime Minister. It has been dealt in the steering committee of the government report on the future, which is consisting of state secretaries and chaired by the State Secretary of the Prime Minister. It has been dealt in all ministries' executive boards, all ministries' permanent secretaries, which are the most senior public officials in ministries, have dealt with this work. All state secretaries, which are the state secretaries of the ministers. It has been dealt in the government evening session, which is an informal meeting held between the ministers, which is convened by the Prime Minister, and usually this takes place before the government plenary session. Then it goes to the government plenary session and it's sent to the Parliament's plenary session. In that plenary session, it's then sent to the committees for them to be working on it. So it will be going to the Parliamentary Committee for the Future. They will have substantial hearings, hearing experts about that report, and they will prepare their Parliament's future report, which is usually including resolutions, what they expect the government to do better or to really put perhaps more focus on. And then it's sent to the Parliament's plenary session and it's sent to the government. And every single year we, in our government annual report, then report back to the Parliament regarding those resolutions. What have we done? How we have improved. And then there are a couple of steps still missing. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I was at a hearing in the Committee for the Parliament regarding the answer of the government back to the Parliament regarding the resolutions. And if they want to make sure that some things written in those resolutions also in the future will be taken care of, they leave it open. So next year, in the government annual report, we will again report back to the Parliament and say what we've done. If the Parliament, if the Committee for the Future thinks that this has been sufficiently dealt with, the government has sort of developed or done something better or what they expect us, they will remove that and then it's not reported back in the annual report anymore. I hope this is not too complicated, but this is really unique in the world. This doesn't exist anywhere else. And I think this is the accountability. This is this futures dialogue that we have, which is the backbone of the futures work of trying to do better as a whole, as a country, as government. So it is important to build capacity and capability about thinking the future as the future is a moving target. Now I'm looking at the watch. I wonder if I have few remarks which are more like my personal ones, which are not really so now I'm sort of moving into a little bit more perhaps theory side of things. So or just sort of free thinking. Now in the pandemic we have had a situation where uncertainty has really come close. That was something that I mentioned a bit earlier. but it also has a risk. This massive uncertainty also leads to people looking for certainty. So we have a sort of paradoxical situation that there is more demand for foresight, but then people's minds are sort of geared into wanting to know the future, and what we really are working on is dealing with the uncertainty. So I think this is something, we have this so-called tyranny of today, or nowism, or I don't know how you want to call it, but everybody's very busy. We just came out of this couple of year pandemic. Now we have a war in Europe. Russia has attacked Ukraine, and this is really I think also impacting people's minds, that there is like too much going on, too much uncertainty. And, but we have to continuously find responsive, work across sectors, involve all levels of government, and watch for the capacities to implement and deliver to meet the challenges we are facing. You probably all heard about Donald Rumsfeld. There are things that we know, things that we know that we don't know, things that we don't know that we don't know. And foresight can help. It gives a framework for sort of knowing. So when we talk about known knowns, you can think about megatrends, trends, sort of weak signals, and what are the known unknowns? Those are these uncertainties, critical uncertainty scenarios. And then I have a hypothesis that the unknown knowns is sort of if we only knew what we know. Where we come to a point I'm going to make later on, usually foresight projects, foresight work is projects, and that's a mistake. We really need to institutionalize foresight and get away from projects. They have a start and they have an end. And usually what happens in projects, they are done with best buddies or people that we know. So there is a risk of group thinking, and these biases start to kick in. And if we have good structures, and foresight is included and embedded in those structures and is institutionalized, like this government report on the future process I described, there is more chance of it being open. We get more diverse thinking, and foresight is fundamentally about thinking and about better thinking. And then there is the wild cards and the black swans we also need to take care of. But if we lack structures to deal with certainty, to deal with uncertainty, we've vanished projects and really made sure that it's in structures. It's very difficult to also tackle the wild cards. But also we have black elephants. So if I have time sometime in the future life, I would like to write a book about taboos, about things in futures work. It's surprising how many things are where people who practice foresight, are practitioners of foresight, are told that oh, don't touch that, or don't talk about this. And this should be really free from these kind of black elephants. So if somebody says that can't happen, or says, don't touch that, those are like, make a list of the things, because you especially need to talk about those issues. And this evolves, it's everywhere. Albert Einstein has said if he had 1 hour to solve a problem and his life depended on the solution, he would spend 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask. For once I know the proper question, I could solve the problem in less than 5 minutes. But this takes place. We're so busy. people's daily lives are full of meetings. It's like, I'm so busy. And we don't have enough time to think. And like I said, foresight is about thinking. You can't outsource thinking. You have to take accountability and ownership of the thinking. And but it's very difficult in these busy times, and especially when we're in crisis. It accelerates the busyness. But how do we tackle this issue? So what happens is what this quote is saying: I don't have time to see any crazy salesman. I have a battle to fight. We need a map to navigate, but do we have an updated map? There is a very famous cartographic mistake, which is the island of California. And the mistake was copied into new maps. Even though there was new information coming in, it's not an island, it took quite a long time before the maps were updated. And that leads us to also question, what kind of a map do we have to navigate? What kind of processes do we have to update our understanding of the situation? And how do we recognize an outdated map? So I just read that about this new continent. So there are still issues that we are discovering new things, and we are steering with a flawed map quite most of the time. Our views are based on our perceptions. So I love this picture, even though it's a little bit childish, but it's just to remind ourselves that if we take our best buddies who think like us, we will be just in one of those pictures. If we really include diverse thinking, we might get a better picture. And what kind of processes, what kind of platforms do our decision makers or ourselves have to have a more complete picture? But then there is an issue also that we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. Generally, it's like when I talked about the known knowns. So there is one of the basic works in megatrends or this continuity thinking was the book of John Naisbitt, and he said trends like horses are easier to ride in the direction they are already going. So let's just make sure that we have at least that box tackled. We know our known knowns. But then the former head of strategic planning in Shell has said scenarios can help us to think the unthinkable, anticipate the unknown, and utilize both to make better strategic decisions. It's just to test our thinking and to make better decisions. But in all our work, we have to be aware of filters. There are different, there is surveillance, observation filter, cognitive mental filters, and also power filters that prevent us from getting that complete picture. So it's also good to stop and think what could be the filters in my environment where I'm trying to understand what is going on. So some reflections, and this is my last point. Is there a budget and resources, or is this another worthy cause? Well, very often, foresight is wanted. There are high expectations of what the foresight and future thinking must deliver, but then very often we lack resources and we lack money. So that's like one of the things that we would need to take care of. Outsourcing strategic thinking is a risky business, and foresight should be free from red tape and black elephants. Building organizational capacity and capability to actively think about the future is better bet than trying to find a guru who knows the future. And this is still there is misunderstandings of what foresight does. And too often that misunderstanding is that we make predictions or that we are sort of guessing the future right. Institutionalizing foresight, I've mentioned, we need to put strategic foresight where decisions about future are made and to move away from those projects. And it's important to engage top decision makers in scenario processes on critical uncertainties, harness a dialogue on our assumptions on which our strategies are built. And we should not just look at continuities, but also at the unknown, discontinuities, surprises, and disruptions. And here, perhaps my last quote, 9/11 Commission, one of the findings in their report is that one of the gravest failings was in imagination. And they said that we should bureaucratize imagining and imagination. And I think this is something which is a challenge for all of us. Happy futures. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaana, for the presentation. There's a few questions online for you.
Yes.
The first question is, what are the biggest future problems for Finland in your view? Is the demographic crisis on top?
Okay, I find the question here. We don't have a luxury of just picking one. We have many challenges. So I think the slide that I put here on the questions are something that we have to tackle all of these issues. So it's about the future of our welfare society. And it's about climate change. Now this war, the unlawful attack of Russia on Ukraine has really put us on a different path. So now we are applying for NATO. I think we all hope that NATO ratification processes would be over and done with. There are still 2 countries that haven't ratified that process. So there is a lot of uncertainty. Some are more imminent, but I think those questions would be my answer. So it's not just one. Demographics, yes, we need more people in our working life. Perhaps we should get more so-called ulkosuomalaisia, outer Finns. Finns, we have 300,000 people with Finnish passports living outside of Finland. And I think one of the things would be great that we would get more of those Finns returning back to Finland, bringing their understanding and knowledge.
All right, thank you. The next question was, is the changed security situation around Russia dominating the conversation around decision-making for the future right now?
Well, of course it is something that has impacted us. For example, in our work, we are looking at the future of Russia, or it's an uncertainty for us. So we've created hypotheses for how Russia will look like in 2040. At the same time, we've looked at the great power rivalry, how that could look like in 2040, how EU is looking in 2040, how rule-based system is looking in 2040. So it's many things. Which it's not only Russia, it's like in this rule-based system, the future of United Nations. We have a Security Council. Russia is a permanent member. So we have flaws in our systems. How do we change those? But of course, at the moment, it's something we are, of course, looking into but it doesn't mean that we stop looking at other things. Yeah.
Thank you. And the last question online was, are you aware of any other countries, maybe within Europe, having a similar committee for the future? Is the Finnish government observing those for commonalities and lessons learned, perhaps?
So Iceland is one of the newest countries that have established a committee for the future. And we don't, like, for example, European Parliament doesn't have a committee for the future. So the European Commission has started to submit these foresight reports on a yearly basis, but it doesn't really have that counterpart. So one question is, will the European Parliament create this kind of a body? And then there will be this futures dialogue, not only from Commission to the member states, but also within European Union. I think in European Union there are some being established. I don't think they are yet in operation, but there are other countries who are benchmarking Finland. And like I said, now who are developing these kind of similar structures are in Finland at the moment. So this first meeting of so-called committees for the future, even though they don't run under the same name, is taking place in Finland at the moment. So it's more like we are the benchmark, and whether it's government foresight or the committee for the future. So I think then another country which is very advanced in using foresight in government is Singapore. So we are the two countries that are perhaps benchmark the most. But of course, we have this ongoing dialogue also with other countries, and we try to learn from them. And there is it's a close community, or small community, better, not close, but yeah, small community, and we exchange ideas to do our works better all the time.
All right, thank you for the answers. Are there any questions in the audience here?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Question is whether it's all open and publicly accessible, or are there some sort of special limits on secrecy?
Sorry, I can't hear.
If there are some sort of special levels of secrecy or confidentiality, or if it's open to public to read as well, these kind of reports.
So this report is open, and it has not yet been published. So it is yet to be published. It was supposed to be published last autumn. And of course, because we talk about the developments outside of Finland as well, there are perhaps some sensitivities, and that's perhaps one of the reasons it's not yet out. But it is going to be published, and it's it's an open document. So the day it is dealt in the plenary session, so we are at the moment in this phase. It is yet to go to the plenary session in government, and the minute it does that, it becomes a public document. And then it's being sent to the parliament, and everybody can read it. And it's at least going to be translated into Swedish. But the idea is to create dialogue, a public dialogue. So, so it will be public. The second part of the report is looking at, I didn't talk that much about that. It's about how we can better our law drafting processes to integrate foresight in them, and how we can take better care of future generations. So at the moment, United Nations is doing a lot to improve sort of the rights of future generations. And we are also thinking of ways how we can better take care of the rights of future generations. There are a lot of law cases. So for example, in Germany, the Fridays for Future group sued, and they won in High Court, and the High Court established that the climate law in Germany was partly unconstitutional because it was pushing the negative effects too much for the future generations. So we are seeing more of these kind of developments, and that's what the second part of the report is tackling. Yes.
All right, thank you for the question and for your answer. If there are no more questions, then I'd like to thank Jaana for the presentation.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you all. The next lecture is going to be on November 8th. There's going to be a little break. And I'd like to remind everybody who might be watching from abroad that by November 8th, we return from daylight savings time to regular time. So make sure you open the stream on time then. Thank you and see you next time.